slide I skipped over last time on RAID. I'm going to finish that, and then we will switch back to the I/O subsystems lecture. Okay, so remember last time we were talking about disk scheduling. Okay, so we looked at disks. We looked at how I/O requests should be scheduled by disks. We talked a little bit about tertiary storage devices like tapes and optical drives like CD-ROMs and so on. And then I was talking about SSDs and RAID storage as other types of storage medium. Okay. RAID storage typically used by servers. Okay. Basically what happens is you take a set of disks and you provide a logical abstraction of a single large logical disk to the rest of the operating system. Okay. Now, you could, of course, just have more than one disks on a server and look at these, meaning you can manage these disks independently. Okay, so if you do that, okay, so if you have, let's say, 4-disk system and you're managing each disk independently, this is in industry parlance referred to just a bunch of disks. Okay. Some people like acronyms, they can come up with it faster than you can imagine. So this one, if you don't have just a bunch of disks, but you basically take all these disks and create this single logical disk abstraction, you have a disk array. Okay? The most common kind of disk array is what's called RAID, which is another acronym for redundant array of independent disks. Okay? So I mentioned two advantages of RAID last time. One is you can have a single file be larger than the size of disk. If you have a very large database, for instance. Okay? So you can basically have it be larger. You can use the storage space on multiple disk drives to store very large storage objects. Okay? Second advantage is you get parallelism. You send off a request, and if your request accesses data that's now chopped up into smaller blocks that are spread onto disk, you can actually get I/O throughput of n disks potential for every disk, for every request. Okay. So the way internally your disk array controller actually stores files on disk arrays is referred to as striping. And what you do is you take a file, you chop it up into blocks like you normally do. But rather than putting all the blocks of a file on a single disk, what you do is you put the block 1 on disk 1 and block 2 on disk 2 and block 3 on disk 3 and so on. So you basically scatter the blocks across multiple disks. So every file that you actually store on a disk array is potentially spread across multiple disks. And the OS doesn't actually have to do anything. It is being done at the hardware level for you.
Does a different logical processor have to be devoted to each disk in the array?
Different controller?
A different processor for pushing data.
Right. So disk arrays are managed by a hardware disk controller. Okay. So the controller is dealing with when a request comes in, it can figure out which disk to actually go and retrieve it from. Okay. And once you create this logical disk abstraction, the fact that there are multiple disks underneath is hidden from the OS. Okay. You basically get these individual disks. You constructed an array or a volume, and you basically all of these look like a single large disk. Okay, so you just send in request, and the array controller will figure out where that block is. Is it on disk 1 or disk 2 and get it from? So that array controller is just one microcontroller.
I mean, for the purposes of writing, for instance, like if you wanted to write faster with striping.
Right. So what happens is all of that is still done at the disk controller level. So the disk controller will have higher throughput than a single disk. You can write faster to the disk controller and it will be able to send those request requests. So you can still do it. You don't need more than one processor to do it because in any case the CPU is much faster than its I/O device. So you can always write out faster. Okay. Now, what are these things here? They are labeled RAID 1 and RAID 0, RAID 1, RAID 2, RAID 3. So what that is actually is a way to introduce redundancy into disk arrays. Now, when you have multiple disks and you are storing your data across multiple disks, the chances of any one disk failing also goes up. Okay? If P is the probability of a failure of a disk, okay, as the number of disks increases, the probability of failure is going to grow linearly. Okay? So think about you have a 10-disk array or maybe a 100-disk array. Can you partition your files across all of these disks and one of those disks dies out? So potentially you have lost blocks of every file that you stored on this disk. If you had managed these disks as just a bunch of disks or JBOD, then only files that are stored on that disk would be gone, but the rest of the disks would be fine. Now, if you scatter your data across all the disks, failure of a single disk means all the files are now missing some data. So that is potentially harmful. So what you have to do is whenever your disk arrays, you have to put in more redundancy at a hardware level. Okay, so this is basically what is done by RAID, which is why it's called redundant array of multiple disks. So you have to store extra data so that even if a disk goes down, you can reconstruct the data on the failed disk. Okay? Simplest form of redundancy is called mirroring. Okay? You take two disks, okay, whatever you store on this disk is also you store a copy on the other disk. Okay? If this disk goes down, you have a copy on the other. Okay? Typically, if you do mirroring, you will have a larger disk array, let's say 6 disk array. Okay? And then when you do mirroring, you treat these 3 disks as one array, and then this is a mirror for this array. So whatever you store here, a copy is stored there. Okay? So a failure of any one disk is not going to impact the availability of data. Okay? Clearly, so this is referred to as RAID 1, okay, which is simple mirroring. Okay? One disadvantage of this scheme is that half the disks are wasted in terms of capacity. They're used for redundancy. Okay? Your storage cost will double in terms of hardware just to get redundancy. Okay, so these other RAID levels try to introduce redundancy, but without the doubling of hardware capacity, doubling of hardware. Okay. So what they do is they use more complicated forms of redundancy rather than simple mirroring, which just says store a copy. You do it more cleverly. And here is the basic theory. Okay, the theory is very simple. It says if your 2 bits, okay, A and B, if you actually do an XOR operation on these 2 bits, you get a third bit. Okay, A XOR B gives you. Okay, so what you then do is you take these pieces of info. Let's say you have 3 disks. You store A here, you store B here, you store the A XOR B value here, which I just called P. Okay? That is your redundant bit, that or piece of data you store. Okay, now let's assume one of the disks goes down. Let's say this disk goes down. Okay? If you want to reconstruct A, you would get this back by the simple property of XOR. If A XOR B is P, then basically this also means that A is B XOR P. Okay, that's what XOR operation does for you. Okay. So if this entire disk goes down, and if you want to get a block on this disk, you get the corresponding block on this disk, you get the corresponding block on this disk, which is called the parity disk. You just do an XOR and that gives you back the block here. And you can do this arbitrarily. Okay, you can actually, this property will extend for as many bits as you want. So if you have 3 A XOR B XOR C is P, then if you want to get back A, you have to do this. So you can add
what if 2 disks fail?
2 disks fail, you're out of it. Okay, this is going to basically store, this is called single fault tolerant, okay, one fault tolerant system, which means it can handle up to a single disk failure. If you want to basically to have dual fault tolerant system, you have to have something that basically is RAID 6 or above, which will have even higher forms of redundancy. Okay, until RAID 5, you can only handle one disk failure. If you want to multiple disks failure, you have to store more redundant information.
So at which point do you get like auto healing, where you can just put in a blank disk and still be able to heal back to where it originally was? Is that RAID 5 or is that RAID 6?
So the question is, this is an artifact of this controller. So if a disk fails on your system, okay, what you can do is you can just buy a blank disk and plug it into the system, and your disk controller will automatically regenerate the data that was on the failed disk by reading each block, running XORs and storing it on the. Okay, so this is referred to as auto healing. You don't have to do anything, the data comes back magically to you. Okay? All disk controllers will do this regardless of the RAID level. Okay? Even if you are mirroring, you basically just put in a disk, it's just going to take the failed disk data, reconstruct it and put it in. Right? So they just copy. For all of these other things, it's just going to run this XOR for you in the background and reconstruct. So you don't need to have a particular RAID level to reconstruct. All of them will allow you to reconstruct. And the controller will just use the right redundancy technique to regenerate the data. Okay. Any other question on this?
Well, except 0. Except RAID 0.
Well,
Except RAID 0. RAID 0 means no redundancy. RAID 0 just says you just store the data as a logical array without having any redundant information. Okay, so RAID 0 is where we started from. Okay, so that is RAID, which brings us to the end of our discussion on disks, and we are going to switch to more broadly I/O devices, and using disk as our example. Okay, so what we'll do today is to understand how I/O devices work, how device drivers work, how device drivers communicate with I/O devices, and so on. Okay, so just some terminology here. So if you go, I think, if I want to bring that picture back that we started off with the very first class. So that picture had a system bus. Remember, it had the CPU, it had memory, and it had I/O devices. Okay, so we'll assume that there is a system bus that allows the CPU to communicate with I/O devices. Okay, so that's a given. Okay, now how does the CPU communicate with I/O devices? Each I/O device has an address. Okay, this is referred to as its port number. Okay, so that's the address by which you can actually talk to that device. Okay, so a device port is basically the unique identifier or the address for that device. Okay. Now typically, to take any arbitrary I/O device, it will at least have 4 registers on it that allow the CPU to communicate with it. Okay, the 4 registers here are, this is the simplest form of devices. There's a status register, a control register, a data in and a data out register. Okay. Control registers is where you write commands to the device saying go do this operation. Okay. The status register is what the device will tell you what is happening. It will say either your command failed or the device is presently busy. Whatever the device is doing, it communicates back to the CPU through the status register. Okay. And there's a data in and a data out register. As the name suggests, one is for writing to the device and the other one is to read back from the device. You can either put data or get data out. Okay. Now there's a hardware component called a controller that is responsible for actually doing this communication. Right. Each device will have a different set of commands. Okay. There is a control register, that's common, but the command set will depend on the device itself. Okay. Now the controller for that device actually knows the commands that the device will accept, and it's the one that is going to do the low-level communication to the device. Okay. The OS of the device driver will issue higher-level commands saying go read some data from this device. Okay. Now that read command is going to will be translated to the appropriate hex command that will be returned to the control register by the controller. Okay. The device driver doesn't need to know that. Okay. It basically issues a slightly higher-level command. So it receives commands in the system bus, translates them to device-specific actions, and issues those commands. Okay, just to show a picture here. This is sort of a I/O subsystem of a machine. Okay, the system bus is not shown here. Okay. What is shown instead is the PCI bus. You must have heard of PCI bus on the device, or PCIX. So these are I/O buses. Okay, so these are buses of which I/O devices hang off. Okay, so you can see that the graphics card may be plugged into a PCI bus, and then the graphics controller will actually talk. This is the card itself. Will talk to the monitor. And it will output pixels onto the monitor. Here is a IDE disk controller. Okay. So it's also plugged into the I/O bus, and then there are multiple disks can be plugged into a IDE disk controller. Okay. And the controller is responsible for communicating with this. So you may have a USB bus, which I did not show here, and lots of devices hanging off the USB bus. Here's a SCSI controller. Okay. And those are SCSI disks, and there's actually this controller itself has its own bus of which you can have multiple SCSI disks hanging.
Does the PCI bus connect to the system bus, or how is that?
PCI bus typically connects to the system. There is actually another PCI bus controller which will interface with the system bus.
System bus on one side.
So it has to arbitrate between the system bus and the PCI bus.
Would the USB bus be connected to the PCI bus or to the system bus, or would it depend on the system?
It would, well, how the USB is connected depends on the system. So there are some that may directly talk to the system bus.
Do all the PCI slots share the same PCI bandwidth?
Do all the PCI slots share the same PCI bandwidth? So now with that, 5 years ago the answer would have been yes. Now you have what is called PCI-X, which is an extension of PCI. So you can have old PCI devices and new PCI devices that both sit. It's like you can have a USB 3 port, but you can plug in a USB 2 device onto it. So that will be slower than having a USB 3 device. Same kind of, the technology is advanced, but it's backward compatible. You can have newer devices that will be faster and old devices that still work. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But if you're two of the same kinds, both new devices, they would actually have the same I/O bandwidth capabilities. Okay, so that's basically the hardware schematic of an I/O subsystem. Here is the software architecture of how all of these actually interface with the kernel itself. So these are your devices. Okay. So here are the controllers. Okay, so that's the lowest level to which the device, so that's hardware, and this is hardware and this is hardware. Okay, here are this is basically where the OS boundary is and the hardware boundary begins. So these are the device drivers. At the lowest level in your kernel stack, those are the things that actually talk to the device. So you need one for each device. Okay. So the device driver is the piece of code in the kernel that understands what the device does, and it enables I/O to and from that device. For every device in the system, you need a device driver, so that the OS can actually talk to it. Okay, so the rest of the OS will not actually worry about the specifics of the device. All of the intricacies or idiosyncrasies of the device is contained in the device driver. Okay? So there's a kernel I/O subsystem which is very generic. Okay? It is going to use higher level I/O commands to talk to a specific device. So you issue that command to the device driver. The device driver interprets it and issues an appropriate command to the device controller. The controller then goes and actually reads or writes commands to the registers of the device and enables the I/O. So this is how I/O commands are going to trickle down from the kernel subsystem. Okay, and as far as the users are concerned, you will interface with system calls. Okay, so you make system calls that might actually come to the kernel subsystem, they go to the device driver. From there you go to the hardware level, you go to the controller and to the device. Okay. Now given the diversity of devices you have in the system, and here you already have half a dozen or more, you cannot expect the rest of the kernel to be very I/O specific. Okay, there are lots and lots of I/O devices that you can plug in. Okay, so you need some abstractions such that the rest of the kernel I/O subsystem and even user processes can interact with devices using these higher level APIs. Okay? And those are then translated by the device driver into specific commands to the device. Okay? So you need this separation. Otherwise your kernel will be very complicated, because to write to a disk versus write to a graphics card versus write to some other device, you may need to actually have specific code in the OS. That's not done. Okay, you just say write, and that goes to the device driver, which performs a device specific, implements a device specific version of the write command. Okay, so this is how you will modularize the kernel. Okay. So this table is just illustration of the ports that you have in a system. There is the hardware. So these are the hardware addresses that are assigned to various kinds of devices. Okay, so those are the unique identifiers that you will use to communicate with that device. So you will see that there are these ranges to accommodate multiple types or instances of a device. So you will see there's a game controller and a serial port, there's a hard disk controller, parallel port, a graphics controller. Each of those have a certain I/O address range. And that's the address of the device. That's what the OS is going to use to communicate with the device. So you don't use names inside the OS, you are going to use these addresses. Okay, so with that background, let's talk a little bit about what I/O services are provided by the OS, how some of these things actually work. Okay. So as far as the I/O subsystem is concerned, there are a number of things that the OS has to do. It has to allow a naming convention by which user level processes can communicate with the device. I'll talk about that in just a moment. There has to be access control. You can't let user processes directly access devices. That's a privileged operation. So you allow system calls, and even after system calls, you have to figure out which device, which processes are actually allowed to read or write to a device. You can't have an arbitrary user process just go and write some pixels on a screen. You have to go through a specific API. Otherwise, you will just go and write garbage on a screen, and that's a problem. Okay. So you need to only allow operations that are appropriate to devices. Okay. You can't write to a keyboard. You can only read from a keyboard. That's a read-only device. Okay. The generic interface is not going to say you cannot do write. If you do write, something has to give an error saying this device is a read-only device. Okay. So there are certain operations that work for some devices, and certain operations that don't make sense. So you have to deal with all of that. Okay. Device allocation is just the addressing. I have showed that. Okay. Now you need to implement performance optimizations like caching and buffering. Okay. Because I/O devices are slow, we have to have means inside the OS to allow you to access these devices without significantly slowing down application performance. This is typically done through buffering and caching. Okay. We will talk about how that is done later on in the lecture. Okay. I/O scheduling, this is if multiple concurrent requests to the device come in what order to schedule them. Okay. We already looked at how this is done for disks last time. We did seek, scan, SSTF, so that's scheduling for disk. You could potentially think of scheduling requests for every I/O device. Okay. Most I/O devices, they'll just do FCFS, first come, first serve. You don't actually schedule anything. But for devices that make sense, you might actually schedule or prioritize your requests in some order. Okay, but that has to be implemented in the device driver if necessary. Yeah, error handling, if the device gives you an error, what should you do? Retry, throw back an error to the application. So all of this is also something that you handle. And you need an interface to write new device drivers. Okay. There's a well-defined kernel interface. Every kernel has an interface that says if you want to write a new device driver, here are the operations you must actually implement in your device driver. The rest of the kernel subsystem will talk to the device driver through that well-defined interface. Okay, so defining that interface and allowing the kernel developers to write new device drivers in another service. That you have to do. So any questions on this? Okay, so I just want to say something about the very first point there, which is naming of files and devices. So like different operating systems have different conventions on how you allow user programs to access devices. In Unix, Linux, and even in Mac, you actually give file names to devices. Devices look like files. Okay, typically, there's a specific directory. If you go into any Unix machine and you go into /dev, which stands for devices, you will actually see all the devices that are exposed to you as file names. Okay, so let's just see in this machine. Okay, so here are some devices that you see. That's the console. Here is a Bluetooth modem device. That's a disk 0. That's basically, so if you had the right privileges and you just opened /dev/disk0, you could actually write directly to the disk. Okay, most processes don't have that privilege, but this is what you can actually do. So we'll see a whole set of these disk partition. There's a null device that doesn't do anything. There's profiling devices. There's some CPU devices.
How does this differ from what's in /mount and /volumes? /mount/volumes.
So in volumes, you actually have disk partitions.
Okay.
These are actual hardware devices exposed to you as file names. Okay? These are not real files. These are called special files. So you will see actually there are some special bits here. C here stands for a character device. You can have block device as well. Okay? So this is just a shortcut to access that device. This is a human readable way. So you can have something like /dev/mouse on Linux. If you want to just read mouse input, if you just open this file and just started reading, whatever mouse events are generated will actually be delivered to you through this file interface. Okay? Yes.
Is that the driver or the device itself?
This is not a driver. This is a way to access, read or write to the device.
Okay. So,
If you are writing a user program and you have the right privileges, you could actually open this device and start doing I/O to that device.
and I guess pass the-
Internally, this is going to get translated to go to the device driver, and device driver will do. This is just a convenience for a user to read or write to I/O device. Yes.
I think you're answering.
What is real?
What is group? That's a Unix group.
Oh, okay.
It's a group of pseudo privileges.
A lot of those things. So there are these numbers here which are called major device numbers and minor device numbers. So this is the device type, this is the instance within that device. All Unix terminology, which most other OSs don't make any sense. Yes.
So just to be clear, they're not actually like writing to a file, it's just.
They're not writing to a file. This is
they're
just a file
described as
name,
files, yeah.
which is just looks like a file, but it's, if you had privileges to access this device, you would be writing to a hardware device, reading or writing to a hardware device. This is the Unix way. Okay? Everything is a file. Everything looks like a file, even though it may not be a file. So hardware devices look like files, even though they are not. Okay? So that's just one way. Now clearly other operating systems have other ways. But regardless, you have to provide a way to name a device and access it. In Unix or Linux, you basically use the /dev method. But there are other ways to name devices as well.
So does your USB interface have a file name?
Yes, so if you will actually go and you'll say /dev/USB-A, USB-B, which will be the ports. If you go out into a Linux machine, you'll see that. Okay, so that's the naming. Now let's talk a little bit about how I/O is actually, how I/O to a device is actually done by the CPU or the device driver. So let's assume that you want to write to some generic device or read from that generic device. Okay? This is the simplest way to do it. This is what your device driver code is actually going to do. Okay? So some process or the OS has made a request to the device driver saying, go read or write to this device. Okay? So when you see CPU, think device driver code that's running on the CPU. Okay? So this is just a short form. So the device driver code is going to first do a busy wait until the device status becomes idle. Okay, so remember I said there are 4 registers on a device. Right? The status register, the control, the data in and data out. So you basically sit there and just read the status register. Is the device available to accept a new I/O command? Okay, if it says idle, you are good. If it says busy, you can't do anything because it's in the middle of an I/O command, I/O request. So you busy wait until the status becomes idle. Then you write whatever command you want into the command register. Okay, so if it's a read, you will say read and the address. If it's a write, you are going to just say write, okay, and provide the address. And then you are going to say or write a bit saying the command is ready to execute. Okay, at this point, the controller will go off and take whatever you have written into the command register, interpret it and execute that command for you. Okay, so the controller will read in the command register, okay, and then basically, in this case, if you are trying to, depending on whether you are trying to read or write, you will either read from the data register and write that to the device, or if read something from the device and write it to the data out register. Okay, so data can go in or out. And then once the operation succeeds, you are going to write something to the status register and says idle again. Okay, at that point, your device driver in this case is polling, which means sitting there busy waiting for the I/O command to finish. Okay, as soon as the status goes back to being idle, you go and read that register. Yes, I what the date. Okay. So this is the simplest form of communication to an I/O device. It uses polling, it uses busy wait. Okay, clearly, busy wait is not the most efficient way to do it, but that is the simplest thing you will have to do if you write a device driver. Okay. Now, keep in mind that this is also 1 byte at a time I/O communication. Okay, because that device register actually can only handle 1 byte at a time. And we'll see techniques by which you can write larger chunks. So for things like a keyboard, this works fine because a keystroke is one byte that is going to get generated. So you press this particular key and that's what you are going to read. But for many other devices, 1 byte at a time is not going to work, and polling is clearly wasteful. Okay? So if you want to make it a little more efficient but still 1 byte at a time, you can use interrupts. Okay, so in this case, the device driver is a little more efficient. You issue the command, okay, and then you basically just go off and say, interrupt me when done. Okay, and then the IO, the kernel is going to go off and do something else, potentially even schedule another process to execute. Okay. And then, this may not be visible, the text is very small, so it says device driver initiates IO. Okay, so you go down this path, you basically issue the command to the controller and you come back here and you go off and do something else. At some later point in time, when the controller has actually finished executing that command, it is going to raise an interrupt. Okay. At that point, you go back into the device driver code and then go back and read whatever is in the status register, and if you are trying to read from the device, whatever is now in the data out register, okay, and you extract that data. Okay. So somewhat more efficient because you are not sitting there doing polling. Okay. So most device drivers will do this, not polling, because polling is basically busy wait, it's wasteful. So they will be interrupt driven IO. Yes.
So this is again like 1 byte at a time.
This is still 1 byte at a time. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about how can you do better. But clearly, for most very simple devices, that's okay. You can do IO 1 byte at a time. It's very slow. Okay, you can of course write to disk 1 byte at a time, but you can imagine how slow that's going to be. Okay, so the next form of, so we had, if you remember when we talked about IO very early on, we had done this. We had polling, interrupts, and DMA. Okay, this is a more detailed deep dive into the same thing. So now if you have devices to which you need to read or write lots of data, not just 1 byte at a time, you need a different mechanism. Okay. Direct memory access, or DMA, is one way to do that. Okay, so what happens in direct memory access is as follows. So you have this is the controller, let's say is a disk, is the device. So that's a disk controller. And then you have a CPU. Okay. So when you want to write, let's say, one sector, that's a 512 byte. So first you'll make a buffer in RAM, and whatever you want to write, you are going to store in that buffer. Okay. And then the CPU is basically going to tell the controller saying, I want to write one sector, this is the address of the sector, so you'll write all of that into the command out and say, here is where the data is stored. And you point it to this address in memory. Okay? And then you're done, and then the CPU or the device driver basically goes off and starts doing something else. Okay? Then the controller is actually going to directly read the data from memory, okay, and then write it out to disk, okay, without the intervention of the CPU. Because the controller is just going to talk, so this is your system bus. Controller can, in this case, directly read or write to memory, which is why it's called direct memory access. You're given direct access to RAM to an IO device. Typically, CPU is the only entity that can access RAM until now. Okay. If you have DMA-based devices, you can allow IO devices to potentially directly read or write to RAM. Okay. This is the only way you can speed up IO. Rather than having a CPU write 1 byte at a time, you basically write an entire chunk of data to RAM and say go read from there and write it up. Or if you want to read, you can do the same thing. Say I need to read one sector, go read it and put it in this buffer in RAM. Yeah, so and then basically the IO device will just read it and write it to RAM directly. Okay. Most higher end devices are going to be DMA based. They will also be interrupt driven. So once the IO is complete, then the controller will interrupt the CPU saying your command has finished execution. Okay. So there is no polling here. So it's interrupt driven, and you are not doing 1 byte at a time, you are doing entire memory chunks, okay, using direct memory access. Okay, any questions on this? Yes.
So the CPU accesses RAM through memory controller, right?
Yes.
But that's its own separate bus and its own separate process. That's not an I/O. It's not considered an I/O device,
So
right?
memory is not an I/O
Okay.
device.
And so this would be sort of like a function of the memory controller, where the memory controller allows I/O devices and the CPU to
Right.
detect RAM.
So basically, at this point, if you actually have direct memory access going on, you are going to have memory contention between the I/O device and the CPU. The CPU has gone off and started executing some other process. That process is running on the CPU, potentially reading or writing to RAM. Okay? The I/O controller, and there could be multiple of these devices, they are also potentially reading or writing to RAM. This is why you need a system bus to arbitrate. You can't have concurrent I/O. Okay, so you will basically contend for the RAM access, and one of these devices will be allowed to access RAM in that clock cycle. Once that's done, somebody else has to wait, and then they go next and so on. So the system bus is going to do all this arbitration for you. Okay, because you can't actually write to RAM concurrent in the same clock cycle. You have to basically, because the controller will allow you to arbitrate with the system bus. Yes.
It's kind of a weird question, but is it like kind of treated like a kernel process, like a kernel thread, trying to
This
access?
is, excuse me. So this is not a kernel process, right? That's its own CPU. Controller is actually the reason it's called a controller is a microcontroller. It's a tiny CPU that is basically interfacing with the I/O device. Okay. So it can execute its own code. Okay. It's not software code. It's code that's written in firmware or in hardware. So it's executing its own code and directly interfacing with the. So it's not a process or any such thing. It's code that's running on the microcontroller. Yes, firmware code. Any other question? Okay, so that's DMA. Now let's come back to the applications view of I/O devices. I already showed how naming allows you naming to a file. The naming allows you to access I/O devices without having to figure out hex addresses. If that naming were not in place, you would have to try to remember what is the hex address of this USB device and somehow issue hex instructions to get to it. And now you can just say open/dev/USB1 and you just have access to your USB device. It's much simpler. Okay. But there are many other characteristics that the OS has to deal with and the application programmer also has to deal with, okay, from a device perspective. Okay. First one is whether the device is what is called a character device or a block device. Okay. Character devices are one that allow you to read or write one byte at a time. Okay. Block devices, as the name suggests, allow you to read or write blocks at a time. Okay. Disk is an example of a block device. A keyboard is an example of a character device. It doesn't make sense to read a block of keystrokes. Okay, you read one keystroke and you react to one keystroke at a time. Okay, that's the simplest way. But practically every device you have has to be classified into one of these two categories. But those are the two categories a typical Unix-like operating system will support. Okay, most of them will fall in the character device. The C that you had seen on those bits actually meant it's a character device. If you had a block device, you would have said B there. Okay? So that's one. Second device characteristic is the access method. Is this a sequential device or a random access device? Okay. Again, disks are an example of random access device. You can go and read or write to any location in that device. Okay. Many devices are going to be sequential. Again, going back to keyboard or the mice, that's a sequential device. You are just reading a sequential stream of keystrokes that are coming to you. You don't jump across keystrokes and say, I'm going to ignore the next one, I'm going to go 3 keystrokes down and process that. Okay, that doesn't make any sense. Okay, so you will just assume it's a linear sequence. Okay, but for this, you can go read or write wherever you want. Okay. Third characteristics is timing. This is a synchronous or an asynchronous device. Okay. Most devices are going to be asynchronous. Okay, they have a microcontroller which allows you to issue the command and then they go off and do the I/O, you don't have to wait. If you have a synchronous device, you would actually have to block and wait for the device to finish whatever command you gave and get the request.
Is the network stack a special case of most of these?
Is the network stack?
like a special case of a character or block or sequence or random access or
So the network stack is not a device. The Ethernet card on the machine is the device. So the Wi-Fi card is the device. Okay, so those are the devices. Network stack is just the kernel subsystem that talks to it. Right? So underneath there's going to be still a Ethernet driver or a Wi-Fi driver. So that is an I/O device. So you can ask, is the Ethernet card a character or a block device? Typically it's a block device. You write packets. You don't write bits, you write entire packets. So it's a block device. It's sequential. Okay, you write a packet at a time, you don't jump around. Okay, it is also asynchronous. They have microcontrollers on them. So any device you take, you can think of a graphics card as another device, right? Is it character or block? If you wanted to write entire blocks of pixels, you make it a block. Okay? You would have very slow graphics card that allow you to write 1 pixel at a time. Okay, refresh rate will be terrible. If you have 1 million pixels, you have to write million bytes, you'll have to wait for some time. So you can't actually treat them as character devices. So there are block devices. You can do random access on a graphics card. If you only wanted to take these pixels and update them, you need to be able to say, write this pixel, this pixel, this pixel. So that's random access. You don't have to go and write the whole thing out again. Okay? So most of them are asynchronous. Shareable or dedicated is another dimension. A shareable device says multiple processes can concurrently access it. Dedicated device means only one process can access it at a time. Right? Some devices like I/O can be shared. You can have multiple application processes doing file I/O. A certain other devices you don't share. You don't share mice input, for instance. Only the kernel is the only entity that actually reads those inputs. Okay. Speed is just a characteristic. You'll see how to address. Most of the devices are slow. How to address that? Okay, the one final characteristic is whether this is an input device, output device, or both. Okay. Graphics card output device. You never take inputs unless you have a touch screen, which is a different problem. Most monitors are only output devices. Okay. Keyboard is an input device. You can't write to a keyboard. Disk is both input and output. So that's another characteristic. So here are some examples of what I said in the last slide and how some of these devices, our characteristics map. Okay. So data transfer mode, character or block, terminal is a character device, keyboard is a character device, disk is a block device. Okay. Access method, sequential, random. I already give examples. It says modem or network devices, in this case sequential, CD-ROM random. Okay. Transfer schedule. A tape is a synchronous device. You are actually reading data from tape as it is scrolling through the tape. Okay. Most devices tend to be asynchronous. Okay. So again here tapes is dedicated. You can have only one process write to a tape at a time, but disks, keyboards are shared. Yeah, I want to read, write, we already talked about. Okay. So those are I/O devices. So I'll say a little bit about character and block, and then Sean is going to come by and do a switch to the last lab, okay, because we didn't have a lab discussion yesterday. Okay. So very quickly, block devices and character devices. As I said, block devices are ones where you can write entire blocks at a time. Okay. The I/O granularity is a block of data. Character devices is a byte of data. Okay. They have different kinds of commands. Okay. For block devices, you have read, write, and typically seek if it's a random device. Okay. Here you have a different kind of command. You have get and put, okay, because there isn't anything to do as far as the keyboard is concerned. Then give me the next keystroke. You just have a get command. It's going to just give you the next one. Put, if you want to write one byte, you just say put, okay, because it's typically sequential. Okay. Now, for most of these block devices, you want direct memory access, okay, because you're writing blocks. You don't want to write, you can write a block by translating that to 1 byte at a time request to the I/O device, but that's going to be slow. So you want direct memory access, you want memory and map files, all of these functionality to be enabled. Okay, so that allows you to have good performance as far as I/O is concerned. Okay. Now there's a point here which says raw I/O versus file system I/O. So typically if you have disks, you can allow either raw I/O or you can have access the disk to a file system. The raw I/O basically means you can open the disk and directly write to blocks. Okay. most processes are actually going to read or write disks through the file system. Okay? There are very few applications that are actually going to directly read or write to disks themselves. There are some applications that you can think of.
Something that does recovery, that, what's the JPEG?
So if you have a corrupted compact flash card, you can go read blocks and try to reconstruct that. Right? Typical
Is the bootloader part of the?
bootloader is not a process. So I was thinking databases. And many databases, because they try to optimize performance, they don't actually go through the file system. They manage disk space themselves. So you can have a partition that the database manages. It's a raw partition. Okay, you don't actually format it as a file system. Just create the volume and say go manage it. So in some sense, the database has its own file system that it has put on this, which is makes its accesses more efficient. Okay, so you can have raw I/O in certain cases, but in most cases for blocks or block devices like this, you go through the OS supplied interface. In this case, it's the file system interface. Okay, so I think we go to do your. So I think this is a good time. Let's stop here.